At dawn, over a stretch of ocean that seemed impossibly wide, Allied pilots began reporting something that should not have been there. An enemy fighter, small, agile, almost weightless, appeared far beyond the range anyone thought possible. It turned tighter than anything they had faced, struck with sudden violence, and vanished back into the sky. For many, it felt less like encountering an aircraft and more like meeting a rumor made real. This was the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter that entered the Pacific War wrapped in myth from its very first battles. Flown by pilots believed to possess samurai-like discipline and skill, the Zero quickly earned a reputation for unmatched maneuverability and almost supernatural reach. In the opening months after Pearl Harbor, it seemed to dominate the skies, leaving American and Allied airmen struggling to understand how they were being outflown so completely. Yet buried beneath this aura of invincibility was a truth rarely remembered. The Zero's period of true combat superiority was not measured in years, but in months. As tactics evolved and new aircraft arrived, the legend began to crack. So how did a single fighter come to inspire such fear, and why did that fear fade so quickly? The answer lies at the intersection of brilliant engineering, flawed assumptions, and the unforgiving realities of modern war. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was not born from excess or industrial abundance. It was born from necessity. By the late 1930s, Japan faced a strategic dilemma that would define its approach to air combat. Any future war in Asia or the Pacific would be fought across vast distances of ocean and undeveloped land. Fighters would be required not only to win dogfights, but to escort bombers far beyond the reach of land-based airfields, often for hours at a time. Range was not a luxury. It was survival. When the Imperial Japanese Navy issued its requirements for a new carrier-based fighter, they bordered on the impossible. The aircraft had to combine extreme range, rapid climb for interception, and unmatched maneuverability in close combat. At the same time, Japan lacked high-powered aircraft engines, comparable to those being developed in the United States and Europe. Japanese designers could not rely on brute horsepower. They would have to rely on intelligence, discipline, and ruthless optimization. That task fell to Jiro Horikoshi and his design team at Mitsubishi. Horikoshi understood that the only way to meet the Navy's demands was to make the aircraft extraordinarily light. Every unnecessary ounce was stripped away. Structural members were drilled to remove excess metal. Armor plating for the pilot was eliminated. Self-sealing fuel tanks, still uncommon at the time, were rejected to save weight. The result was an aircraft with a power-to-weight ratio that no Allied fighter could initially match. This design philosophy produced an airplane that excelled in one domain above all others: maneuverability. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outendure nearly every opponent it faced in the early stages of the war. Combined with the superb training of Japan's pre-war naval aviators, the Zero became a lethal weapon. When war erupted in December 1941, the Zero entered combat under near-ideal conditions. At Pearl Harbor, and in the rapid offensives that followed across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, it faced enemies who were unprepared both tactically and psychologically. Many Allied pilots had never seen the aircraft before. Some doubted Japan was capable of producing a modern fighter at all. The Zero's extraordinary range deepened the illusion. This ability to appear suddenly, strike hard, and escape fed the growing myth of invincibility. But even in these early victories, the seeds of future failure were already present. The Zero had been engineered for a specific vision of air combat, one that assumed short, decisive wars and mastery through maneuver alone. As the Pacific conflict expanded and intensified, that assumption would be tested in ways its designers never anticipated. In the first months of the Pacific War, the Mitsubishi A6M0 did more than win air battles. It shaped perception. Its repeated appearances over distant battlefields created the sense that the Japanese Navy possessed an endless supply of elite fighters, capable of being everywhere at once. In reality, the number of operational Zeros was limited, but their extraordinary range allowed the same aircraft to project power far beyond what Allied planners believed possible. This illusion reached its height in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. As Japanese forces surged across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the Zero seemed to escort bombers with impunity. Allied pilots often encountered it unexpectedly, sometimes hundreds of miles from the nearest Japanese-held territory. Commanders searched for carriers that were not there, convinced that such reach could only be explained by overwhelming numbers. The myth of abundance was born not from production capacity, but from engineering. At the tactical level, the Zero reinforced that myth with brutal efficiency. In close combat, it was unrivaled. Its ability to execute impossibly tight turns and sudden changes in direction made traditional dogfighting against it a losing proposition. Many Allied pilots, trained to rely on turning contests and pursuit curves, found themselves slowly but inevitably sliding into the Zero's guns. The aircraft's wing-mounted 20mm cannons, though limited in ammunition, were devastating at close range. A single well-placed burst could shatter a wing root or tear through a cockpit. Compounding the problem was a deep-rooted underestimation of Japanese aviation. Reports from China describing an agile long-range Japanese aircraft were dismissed or ignored. Even aircraft recognition manuals distributed to American pilots at the start of the war failed to include accurate images of the Zero. In the chaos of combat, hesitation and misidentification became deadly. Fear, once established, proved contagious. Pilots spoke of the Zero as if it possessed almost mystical qualities. Each new encounter seemed to confirm the legend, even as the underlying reality remained unchanged. The Zero was not invulnerable, it was simply being fought on its own terms. Yet, even at the height of its reputation, cracks were beginning to form. As the war progressed into 1942, particularly during the Guadalcanal campaign, American pilots began to survive long enough to learn. They compared notes. They analyzed losses. Slowly, deliberately, they began to understand that the Zero's greatest strengths were also boundaries that could be exploited. The myth had reached its zenith. The conditions that sustained it were about to disappear. The turning point for the Mitsubishi A6M0 did not arrive with a single battle or a single new aircraft. It arrived gradually, as American pilots stopped trying to beat the Zero at the one thing it did best. During the bitter fighting over Guadalcanal, in the summer and fall of 1942, a new pattern began to emerge in the air. U.S. Navy and Marine pilots learned, often the hard way, that chasing a Zero in a turning fight was a path to destruction. Survival demanded a different mindset. Instead of circling endlessly, American pilots began to fight with discipline and restraint. They attacked from altitude, using speed and gravity as weapons. They dove, fired, and climbed away, refusing to be drawn into prolonged engagements. This hit-and-run approach, later refined into what became known as energy fighting, exploited weaknesses that had always existed in the Zero's design. At high speeds, its controls stiffened. In a dive, it could not safely follow heavier American fighters. Its lack of armor meant that even a short burst of .50 caliber fire could be fatal. As these tactics spread, the Zero's losses mounted. What had once seemed like an untouchable aircraft was now falling with alarming regularity. The same design choices that had given the Zero its legendary maneuverability now exacted a terrible price. Thin aluminum skins offered little protection. Fuel tanks ignited easily. A single hit to a critical structural point could tear the aircraft apart. Japanese pilots, once confident in their aircraft's agility, found themselves facing opponents who refused to fight on familiar terms. The strategic situation made matters worse. Japan's pre-war system had produced a small number of extraordinarily skilled pilots, but it had never been designed for mass replacement. As casualties increased, experienced aviators were lost faster than they could be replaced. New pilots entered combat with fewer hours, less training, and almost no margin for error. The Zero, demanding precision and finesse, offered them little forgiveness. By 1943, the imbalance became undeniable. New American fighters, the F-6, F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, and the P-38 Lightning, entered the Pacific in large numbers. They were faster, more heavily armed, better protected, and backed by an industrial system capable of absorbing losses and learning from them. In contrast, the Zero remained trapped in an earlier era of design. Incremental upgrades could not overcome its fundamental limitations. The consequences reached their grim climax in June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. What American pilots would later call the Marianas Turkey Shoot symbolized the collapse of Japanese naval air power. Zeros were still present, and they were still dangerous in isolated encounters. But as a system, they were overwhelmed. The myth had not merely faded, it had been destroyed by attrition, adaptation, and the relentless arithmetic of modern war. From an American perspective, the defeat of the Mitsubishi A6M0 was never just about one aircraft outperforming another. It was about systems, training systems, industrial systems, and strategic cultures colliding in a prolonged war neither side could escape. Once the United States recognized that the Pacific conflict would not be short, its response reshaped the balance of power in the air. American air strategy emphasized survivability and learning, Aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair were designed not merely to win engagements, but to bring pilots home alive. Armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, redundant systems, and powerful radios allowed American formations to coordinate, adapt, and fight as a team. Losses were analyzed, tactics refined, and lessons rapidly disseminated across the fleet. Every encounter with the Zero became data. The Zero, by contrast, was the product of a different strategic assumption. Japan had planned for a decisive opening phase, not a grinding war of attrition. Its industrial base struggled to scale production, and its pilot training pipeline could not replace veterans lost in combat. While American universities were turning tens of thousands of young men into aviators, Japan relied on a narrow stream of highly trained professionals. When they were gone, the system faltered. Globally, the Zero's rise and fall became a case study in how myths are born and destroyed in wartime. Early Allied fears were amplified by surprise, distance, and cultural misunderstanding. Later, those fears evaporated as evidence replaced assumption. The Zero was revealed not as a supernatural weapon, but as a finely tuned machine optimized for a form of air combat that was rapidly becoming obsolete. Yet the story did not end with dismissal. Even as it was outclassed, the Zero continued to command respect. American engineers studied captured examples closely. The very fact that Grumman later developed the F-8F Bearcat explicitly intended to outperform the Zero in maneuverability demonstrated that the aircraft had never been entirely ignored or belittled. It had set a benchmark, even as it failed to evolve beyond it. In the broader sweep of history, the Zero's legacy is inseparable from the lesson it taught the world. That excellence in one dimension of warfare cannot compensate for weakness in adaptation, production, and strategy. Wars are not won by legends. They are won by those who learn faster than their enemies. When the Pacific War finally drew to a close, the Mitsubishi A6M0 quietly faded from the skies it had once ruled. There was no final duel, no dramatic last stand that restored its legend. Instead, there was silence, the kind that follows a long war when the arithmetic of loss has already delivered its verdict. The Zero had begun the conflict as a symbol of aerial supremacy. It ended it as a reminder of how quickly warfare outgrows even the most brilliant ideas. In purely technical terms, the Zero was an extraordinary aircraft. No fighter before or since matched its combination of range and low-speed maneuverability so perfectly. In the hands of experienced pilots, it remained dangerous until the very end. But history does not judge weapons by isolated moments of brilliance. It judges them by whether they can adapt to changing conditions, survive new threats, and carry their users through the full length of a conflict. That was the Zero's ultimate failure. Designed for a short, decisive war and a romantic vision of air combat, it had little margin for growth. As American fighters grew faster, tougher, and more heavily armed, the Zero remained trapped within the limits of its original philosophy. Incremental upgrades could not compensate for a lack of protection, firepower, and structural resilience. What had once been strengths became liabilities. The human cost was devastating. Japan's early advantage rested on a small cadre of elite pilots, men whose skill masked the fragility of the system behind them. When they were lost, they could not be replaced. By the final years of the war, Zeros were often flown by inexperienced aviators and used in desperate missions that reflected not courage alone, but strategic exhaustion. The aircraft that had once inspired fear now symbolized how completely Japan's air power had been spent. And yet, the Zero story still matters. It reminds us that myths are powerful, but temporary. That reputation can outrun reality. And that in war, winning the first battles means little if you cannot finish the race. The Zero did not fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because the world changed faster than it could. So what, in your view, was the Zero's greatest lesson for engineers, for strategists, or for history itself? Share your thoughts below. And if you value the hard-earned lessons that military history leaves behind, consider joining us as we explore the next chapter in the long, unfinished story of war.